The gunshot echoed across the Montana territory like thunder on a clear day, sending a flock of startled birds into the vast blue sky as Rebecca Hart crouched behind the abandoned water trough, her heart hammering against her ribs. The year was 1879, and she had been running for 3 days straight, her once fine calico dress now torn and mudded, her copper hair falling loose from its pins. She had escaped from a marriage that had become a prison, and now her husband's hired guns were closing in. Rebecca pressed her back against the rough wood of the trough, trying to steady her breathing. The small frontier town of Silver Creek was just visible through the morning mist, promising sanctuary if she could reach it. Another shot cracked through the air, splintering wood mere inches from her head. "Mrs. Thornton," a gruff voice called out, using her married name like a curse. "Your husband wants you back home where you belong," she bit back a sob. James Thornton, wealthy cattle baron and her husband of 3 torturous years, wasn't a man who accepted losing what he considered his property. And in his mind, Rebecca was precisely that property. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pulse quicken. She'd have to make a run for it, though her worn-down boots and exhausted legs gave her little hope of outrunning men on horseback. Just as she gathered herself to sprint toward town, a shadow fell across her hiding spot. "Madam, you look like you could use some help." Rebecca jerked her head up to find herself staring into the most startlingly blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a tall, broad-shouldered man sitting atop a magnificent chestnut stallion. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, worn leather chaps over denim trousers, a simple blue cotton shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his sun-weathered face. A 6-shooter hung low on his hip, and the easy way he rested his hand near it suggested he knew how to use it. "They'll kill you if you help me," Rebecca whispered, another gunshot punctuating her warning. The cowboy's expression remained calm, but his eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Wouldn't be the first time someone's tried." He extended his hand down to her. "Name's Yates Stanton." "Most folks just call me Yates." Another bullet whistled past them. "I'm Rebecca Hart," she said, making a split-second decision to trust this stranger and use her maiden name. "And those men work for my husband." Yates nodded once, as if that explained everything he needed to know. "Well, Miss Rebecca, I reckon it's time we got moving." Without further deliberation, he leaned down, grasped her forearm, and with surprising strength swung her up behind him on the saddle. The horse, sensing its rider's urgency, needed no prompting and launched into a gallop toward Silver Creek. Rebecca clung to Yates's solid frame, the warmth of him a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in her bones from nights sleeping rough. She glanced back to see 3 riders emerging from the tree line, their horses kicking up dust as they gave chase. "They're following." She cried over the thundering hoofbeats. "They won't follow us into town," Yates replied, his voice steady despite their breakneck pace. "Sheriff Booker doesn't take kindly to outsiders causing trouble." As they approached Silver Creek, the simple wooden structures of the frontier town seemed to Rebecca like the walls of a fortress, promising safety she hadn't felt in years. Yates guided his horse down the main street, slowing to a trot as curious onlookers turned to stare. He pulled up in front of a modest 2-story building with a sign that reads Silver Creek Hotel. "Ms. Eliza runs this place," Yates explained, helping Rebecca dismount. Her legs trembled beneath her, weak from exhaustion and fear. "She's a good woman who asks few questions." Just as they reached the hotel steps, the sound of multiple horses approaching made Rebecca freeze. Her pursuers had followed them into town after all. She turned to see the 3 men dismounting, their expressions grim beneath their hats. The leader, a burly man with a thick mustache whom she recognized as Thornton's foreman, Fletcher, strode forward with purpose. "That's Thornton property you're interfering with, Cowboy," Fletcher called out, his hand hovering near his pistol. "Mr. Thornton wants his wife returned to him." Rebecca felt Yates stiffen beside her. He positioned himself in front of her, his stance casual but his body coiled like a spring. "The lady doesn't appear interested in going back," Yates replied, his voice carrying easily down the street. Several townspeople stopped to watch the confrontation, sensing the tension that crackled in the air. Fletcher's face darkened. "That ain't your concern. We've been authorized to bring her back by any means necessary." Yates's hand rested lightly on his gun belt now. "If Mr. Thornton wants his wife back," he said with deadly calm, "he'll have to go through me." The gasp from the gathering crowd was audible. Rebecca's heart seemed to stop as she realized this stranger was willing to risk his life for her someone he'd only just met. Fletcher assessed Yates with narrowed eyes, clearly trying to determine if the cowboy's confident stance was backed by skill. Whatever he saw must have given him pause, because after a tense moment, he took a step back. "This ain't over," Fletcher warned. "Mr. Thornton doesn't give up what belongs to him. We'll be waiting." With that, the three men retreated to their horses but made no move to leave town. Instead, they crossed the street to the saloon where they could maintain their watch. Rebecca let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, Mr. Stanton." "Yates," he corrected gently, "and you don't need to thank me. No woman should be treated like property." There was something in his tone, a hint of a personal history that made Rebecca wonder what ghosts haunted this man. A plump, gray-haired woman appeared at the hotel door, taking in the scene with shrewd eyes. "Bringing trouble to my doorstep again, Yates Stanton." Yates tipped his hat with a hint of a smile. "Ms. Eliza, this is Miss Rebecca Hart. She needs a safe place to stay." The older woman's expression softened as she took in Rebecca's disheveled appearance. "Come in, child. Let's get you cleaned up and fed." As Rebecca crossed the threshold into the hotel, she felt the weight of Yates's gaze on her back. When she turned, his blue eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'll check on you later," he promised, then added with grim determination, "They won't take you back, Miss Rebecca, not while I draw breath." With those words, he turned and walked toward the sheriff's office, his spurs jangling with each purposeful stride. Rebecca watched him go, a strange mixture of fear and hope swirling within her. She had escaped one man's control only to place her fate in the hands of another. But something told her that Yates Stanton was different. In his eyes, she had seen not possession, but something she hadn't encountered in a long time: respect. Inside the hotel, Ms. Eliza led Rebecca to a small but clean room on the second floor. "The washroom's down the hall," she said, setting down a basin of water and a cake of soap on the bedside table. "I'll bring up some stew and bread when you're ready." Left alone, Rebecca sank onto the edge of the bed, her body finally registering the full extent of her exhaustion. She hadn't truly slept since fleeing Thornton Ranch 3 nights ago. The thought of her husband sent a cold shiver through her. James Thornton had seemed charming and refined when he'd courted her in Denver, where her father's banking business had brought them temporarily. She'd been just 19, naive, and flattered by the attention of a man 12 years her senior who owned half the cattle in northern Montana territory. But the charm had evaporated as soon as the wedding ring was on her finger, revealing a controlling, cruel man who viewed her as nothing more than an ornament and potential mother to his heirs. When no children came after 3 years, his resentment had turned to rage, and the isolated ranch house had become her prison. Rebecca shook away the memories and began to wash the dirt from her face and hands. She would not think of James now. She was free, at least for the moment, and she intended to stay that way even if she didn't yet know how. After washing and changing into a simple dress Ms. Eliza had provided, Rebecca ate her first proper meal in days. As twilight fell, she found herself drawn to the window of her room, which overlooked the main street. The 3 men who had pursued her still lingered outside the saloon, watching the hotel like predators waiting for their prey to emerge. A soft knock at her door startled her from her vigil. When she opened it, Yates stood there, hat in hand, his tall frame nearly filling the doorway. "Sheriff Booker says he'll keep an eye on Thornton's men, but legally, there's not much he can do unless they cause trouble," he explained. "A husband has rights to his wife under the law." Rebecca's heart sank. "So I have no choice but to return," Yates shook his head firmly. "There's always a choice, Miss Rebecca. I spoke with Judge Wilson. He's passing through town on circuit. If you have grounds for divorce, cruelty," she said without hesitation. "And She hesitated, shame washing over her despite herself. He's kept me isolated, controlled every aspect of my life. When I failed to give him children, Her voice faltered, Yates's jaw tightened and his knuckles whitened around the brim of his hat. "Say no more," he said softly. "The judge will hear you out tomorrow. Until then, I'll be staying in the room across the hall." Rebecca blinked in surprise. "You don't have to do that. I made you a promise, Miss Rebecca." His blue eyes held her steadily. "I don't make those lightly." A warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the bowl of stew she'd consumed. "Why are you helping me, Yates? You don't even know me." For a moment, the cowboy's composed demeanor slipped, revealing something raw and painful underneath. "Let's just say I recognize a cage when I see one, even if it's made of marriage vows instead of iron bars." Before she could question him further, he bowed slightly and retreated to his room, leaving Rebecca to wonder about the mysteries that lay behind those striking blue eyes. The next morning dawned clear and bright over Silver Creek. Rebecca had slept fitfully, dreams of James Thornton's rage mingling with strange new visions of blue eyes and gentle hands. She dressed in the same borrowed dress and made her way downstairs to find Yates already at a table in the small dining room, nursing a cup of coffee. "Thornton's men are still out there," he informed her, rising politely as she approached. "But Judge Wilson has agreed to see you at 10 o'clock. Rebecca nodded, trying to quell the nervousness that threatened to overwhelm her. What if the judge sided with James? What if the law, as it so often did, favored the husband's rights over the wife's well-being? As if reading her thoughts, Yates reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. The touch was fleeting but comforting. "Judge Wilson is a fair man, he'll listen." After a breakfast she could barely taste, Yates escorted Rebecca to the small building that served as Silver Creek's courthouse when needed. Fletcher and his men watched their progress down the street, their expressions dark with promised retribution. Judge Wilson proved to be an elderly man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He listened attentively as Rebecca, with trembling voice, recounted the isolation and cruelty she had endured at Thornton Ranch. She spoke of James's controlling nature, his rages when she failed to conceive, and his threats when she had finally gathered the courage to flee. "And where is your husband now, Mrs. Thornton?" the judge asked when she had finished. "In Denver on business, Your Honor," Rebecca replied. "He sent his foreman and these men to retrieve me." The judge considered this information, his fingers steepled before him. "The law generally upholds a husband's right to his wife's company," he began, and Rebecca's heart sank. "However, the law also recognizes that there are limits to a man's authority, even over his wife." He glanced at some papers before him. "I see that Mr. Thornton filed a complaint of abandonment immediately upon discovering your departure. That was most efficient of him." Something in the judge's tone suggested he found such efficiency suspicious rather than commendable. "Your Honor," Yates spoke up from where he sat beside Rebecca. "If I may, Miss Hart has no family here, no means to support herself while awaiting a divorce hearing. Forcing her to return to a man who has admitted through his own men that he intends to take her back by any means necessary would put her in danger." Judge Wilson nodded slowly. "A valid concern, Mr. Stanton." He turned back to Rebecca. "Mrs. Thornton or Miss Hart, if you prefer, I cannot grant a divorce without Mr. Thornton being present, or at least officially notified. However, I can issue a temporary restraining order preventing him or his agents from forcing you to return to the marital home against your will until a proper hearing can be conducted." Relief flooded through Rebecca, nearly bringing tears to her eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Don't thank me yet," the judge cautioned. "This is a temporary measure only. Mr. Thornton will have to be notified and he will have the right to present his side, and you will need somewhere to stay in the meantime." "She can stay at my ranch," Yates said without hesitation. When both Rebecca and the judge looked at him in surprise, he added, "My sister Rose lives there too. It's respectable and far enough from town that Thornton's men won't be watching her every move." Rebecca stared at him, taken aback by the offer. She had assumed he was just passing through Silver Creek, perhaps a drifting cowhand or a ranch hand on an errand. The idea that he owned property here, that he had a life she knew nothing about, reminded her how little she knew about her protector. Judge Wilson considered the proposal. "That seems a reasonable arrangement, provided your sister is indeed in residence, Mr. Stanton. Mrs. Thornton will remain under the court's protection. I'll have the papers drawn up this afternoon." As they left the courthouse, Fletcher was waiting on the steps, his face thunderous. "Judge rule in your favor, did he?" He sneered at Rebecca. "Mr. Thornton won't take this lying down." Yates stepped between them, his hand casually near his holster. "The lady is under the protection of the court now, Fletcher. I suggest you and your men ride back to your employer and inform him that his wife will see him in court." Fletcher's eyes narrowed dangerously. "This ain't over, Stanton, not by a long shot." He spat on the ground near Yates's boots. "Mr. Thornton doesn't forget those who cross him." "Neither do I," Yates replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down threats before and emerged standing. After collecting Rebecca's few belongings from the hotel and saying goodbye to Ms. Eliza, Yates helped her onto his horse and mounted behind her. They rode out of Silver Creek under the watchful eyes of Fletcher and his men, heading north toward the foothills where, Yates explained, his modest ranch lay. "I should have told you I own property here," he said as they left the town behind. "It's nothing grand, 40 acres, a small herd, a decent house my father built before he passed." Rebecca, acutely aware of his solid presence at her back, his arms on either side of her as he held the reins, tried to focus on his words rather than the strange fluttering in her stomach. "You had no obligation to tell me anything, Yates. You've already done more for me than I had any right to expect." She felt rather than saw his shrug. "I was heading home anyway when I saw you hiding from those men, just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "Or perhaps it was Providence," she suggested softly. He was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the rhythmic hoofbeats and the creak of saddle leather. "Maybe so," he finally said, "though I'm not sure Providence has paid much mind to me these past years." There was that hint of a hidden story again, and Rebecca found herself increasingly curious about the man who had risked so much for a stranger. "You mentioned a sister?" "Rose," he confirmed, a note of fondness entering his voice. "Stubborn as the day is long, but the best sister a man could ask for. She keeps the books for the ranch and makes sure I don't live like a complete savage." Rebecca smiled at that. "She sounds wonderful. I always wished for a sister. I was an only child." "Your parents?" Yates asked. The smile faded from her lips. "Both gone now. Father died of pneumonia just after my wedding. Mother passed from heart trouble 6 months later." She swallowed hard. "James didn't allow me to attend either funeral, said the journey to Denver was too arduous for a woman hoping to conceive." She felt Yates's body tense behind her. "I'm sorry," he said, and the simple words carried genuine empathy. "That was cruel." "It was," she agreed, "just one of many cruelties, large and small." They rode in companionable silence after that, Rebecca taking in the beautiful landscape around them. Montana Territory was wild and rugged, but possessed a stark beauty that had always moved her, even during her darkest days at Thornton Ranch. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow even in early summer, and wildflowers dotted the rolling grasslands. By mid-afternoon, they crested a ridge, and Yates pointed to a valley below where a modest homestead nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. A small creek glinted in the sunlight, winding its way past a tidy cabin and several outbuildings. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, Rebecca could make out the shapes of cattle grazing. "Stanton Ranch," Yates announced with quiet pride. "Not much compared to what you're used to, I expect." Rebecca turned slightly to look up at him. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "And it's yours. That makes it worth more than all of Thornton's 1,000 acres. Something flickered in Yates's blue eyes' surprise, followed by warmth. But before he could respond, a figure emerged from the cabin, shading her eyes against the sun as she looked up at them. "That'll be Rose," Yates said, urging his horse down the slope toward home. As they approached, Rebecca could see that Rose Stanton was a petite woman with the same striking blue eyes as her brother, though her hair was a shade darker than Yates's sun-bleached brown. She wore practical clothing, a simple skirt and blouse with a leather vest, and had her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense braid. "Bringing home strays again, Yates," Rose called out as they reached the yard, though her tone was teasing rather than accusatory. Yates dismounted and helped Rebecca down, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Rose, this is Miss Rebecca Hart. She'll be staying with us for a while by order of Judge Wilson." Rose's eyebrows rose, but she stepped forward with an outstretched hand. "Well, that's a story I'll want to hear. Welcome to Stanton Ranch, Miss Hart." Rebecca took the offered hand, relieved at the warm welcome. "Please call me Rebecca, and thank you for having me, especially on such short notice." Rose waved away her thanks. "Any friend of Yates is welcome here. Besides," she added with a mischievous glint in her eye, "it'll be nice to have another woman around to balance out my brother's masculine influence." Yates rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "I'll see to the horse," he said. "Rose, can you show Rebecca where she'll be staying?" As Yates led his stallion toward the barn, Rose linked her arm through Rebecca's. "Come on inside. You look like you could use some rest and a good meal." The interior of the Stanton home was simple but comfortable, with well-crafted furniture that showed signs of loving care. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, and windows let in ample light. Rebecca noted the little touches that spoke of a woman's presence: curtains at the windows, a vase of wildflowers on the table, a quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair. "You'll sleep in here," Rose said, leading her to a small but pleasant bedroom off the main room. "It was our parents' room, but neither Yates nor I could bear to take it after they passed. It's mostly been used for guests, though we don't get many out this way." Rebecca took in the clean linens on the bed, the small dresser with a mirror above it, the braided rug on the wooden floor. It was simple compared to the opulent furnishings of Thornton Ranch, but it felt immediately more welcoming. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "I can't thank you enough for taking me in like this." Rose studied her with those perceptive blue eyes so like her brother's. "Yates told me a bit about your situation on his way to the barn," she said gently. "I want you to know that you're safe here, Rebecca. My brother may look intimidating to some, but he's got a good heart." "I'm beginning to see that," Rebecca admitted, "though I still don't quite understand why he was willing to risk so much for a complete stranger." A shadow passed over Rose's face. "My brother has his reasons for standing up to men who mistreat women," she said, her tone suggesting there was more to the story. But before Rebecca could inquire further, Rose brightened. "Now, let me show you where everything is, and then you can rest before supper." By the time Yates returned from tending to the horses and checking on the cattle, Rebecca had washed up and changed into a clean dress Rose had lent her. It was a bit short for Rebecca's taller frame, but infinitely better than the travel-worn garment she'd been wearing. Supper was a simple but delicious affair of venison stew, biscuits, and home-canned peaches. Rebecca found herself relaxing in the easy company of the Stanton siblings, their gentle banter and obvious affection for each other creating an atmosphere so different from the tense, silent meals she had endured with James. "So you've been running this ranch since your parents died?" she asked as Rose served coffee after the meal. Yates nodded, his expression growing serious. "Pa died when I was 20, Rose just 16. Ma held on for another year, but her heart wasn't in it without him." "I'm sorry," Rebecca said softly, understanding the pain of losing parents all too well. "We managed," Rose said with quiet pride. "Nearly lost the place a couple of times in the early years, but Yates is too stubborn to give up, and I'm too stubborn to let him have all the glory of saving it." Yates chuckled, a warm sound that Rebecca found unexpectedly pleasing. "Truth is, Rose is the brains of this operation. I just provide the muscle." "And modest too," Rose teased, then turned to Rebecca. "What about you? Yates mentioned you're seeking a divorce from a cattle baron." Rebecca's smile faded. Setting down her coffee cup, she told the Stantons her story, how James Thornton had courted her with charm and promises. how the marriage had quickly revealed his true controlling nature, and how she had finally gathered the courage to flee when he was away on business. The worst part was the isolation, she admitted. The ranch is 30 miles from the nearest town. James rarely allowed me visitors, and never without his presence, when my parents died and I received word too late to even attend their funerals. She shook her head, blinking back tears. Something broke in me then. I realized I would die there, alone and forgotten, if I didn't find a way out. And now his men are trying to force you back, Rose said, her expression troubled. They won't succeed, Yates stated firmly. The judge's order prevents them from taking her, and they know better than to try anything out here. Rebecca wasn't so sure. She had seen the determination in Fletcher's eyes, had heard the implicit threat in his words. James isn't a man who accepts defeat, she said quietly. And he has a lot of influence in the territory. So did my father, Yates replied, his jaw set in a determined line. He taught me that a man's word and a man's honor are what matter in this life, not his bank account or the size of his herd. His blue eyes held hers steadily. I gave you my word, Rebecca. I intend to keep it. That night, lying in the comfortable bed in the Stantons' guest room, Rebecca found herself thinking of Yates, the quiet strength in his manner, the gentleness in his hands when he'd helped her from the horse, the fierce determination in his eyes when he'd faced down Fletcher. For 3 years, she had known only James Thornton's brand of manhood domineering, cruel, viewing women as property to be owned rather than people to be cherished. Yates Stanton offered a different vision of what a man could be, and Rebecca found herself drawn to it like a moth to flame. But she was still legally bound to James, still caught in the web of his power and influence. And she had no right to involve Yates and his sister in what could become a dangerous situation. With these troubled thoughts swirling in her mind, Rebecca finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of blue eyes and gunshots and a voice promising protection. The next few days fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Rose, delighted to have another woman in the house, eagerly enlisted Rebecca's help with household tasks. Rebecca, who had been denied even the simplest domestic duties under James's roof, he had insisted that was what servants were for, found unexpected joy in learning to bake bread, tend the vegetable garden, and assist with the laundry. Yates spent his days working the ranch, checking fences, tending to the cattle, breaking a new colt for riding. Rebecca often watched him from the kitchen window as he worked, admiring the easy way he sat a horse, the strength in his shoulders as he wrestled a calf for branding, the patience he showed with the young, skittish colt. In the evenings, they would gather in the main room after supper. Sometimes Yates would read aloud from one of the books. His father had collected Shakespeare, Dickens, even some of the newer American writers like Twain. Other times, Rose would play the small, upright piano in the corner, and occasionally Yates would join in with a surprisingly melodious baritone. It was during these quiet evenings that Rebecca began to truly know Yates Stanton not just as the brave cowboy who had come to her rescue, but as a man with depths and complexities, strengths and vulnerabilities. She learned of his love for poetry, his skill with horses, his fierce devotion to his sister and the land his father had left them. And with each new discovery, the strange fluttering in her heart when he was near grew stronger. On the 5th day of her stay, Rebecca was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart leaped into her throat as she turned to see 3 riders coming down the path to the ranch, but it wasn't Fletcher and his men. Instead, it was Sheriff Booker from Silver Creek, accompanied by 2 deputies. Yates emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag as he walked toward the approaching lawmen. Rebecca hurried to join him, anxiety churning in her stomach. "Sheriff," Yates greeted the older man with a nod. "What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Booker, a grizzled man with a silver mustache and shrewd eyes, dismounted with a grunt. "News from town, Stanton." He tipped his hat to Rebecca. "Madam, is it James?" Rebecca asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. "Has he returned?" The sheriff nodded grimly. Rode into town yesterday with 10 more men. He's not happy about Judge Wilson's restraining order and he's demanding to know where his wife is. Yates's posture stiffened. The judge's order still stands. It does, Booker confirmed. I reminded Thornton of that fact myself, but he hesitated, glancing at Rebecca. He's filing a petition claiming you're mentally unstable, Mrs. Thornton, says you've had episodes of hysteria and delusions and that you're a danger to yourself without proper supervision. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. That's a lie, she whispered. A complete fabrication. It's a common tactic for men trying to control their wives, Rose said, having joined them in time to hear the sheriff's news. Her voice was tight with anger. Claim they're hysterical or insane and have them committed to an asylum. Precisely why I rode out here, Sheriff Booker said. Judge Wilson is holding firm for now, but Thornton's brought a doctor from Helena who's willing to testify to your condition if the judge orders an examination. He could have her declared incompetent, Yates finished, his expression darkening, and nullify the restraining order. Rebecca swayed slightly, and Rose quickly put an arm around her shoulders to steady her. The thought of being declared insane, of being committed to one of the notorious asylums where women were often sent when they became inconvenient to their husbands, was terrifying. What can we do? She asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Sheriff Booker sighed. Judge Wilson suggested it might be best if you weren't in the territory when this petition is heard. He can delay for a few days, but not indefinitely. You're suggesting she run? Yates's voice was sharp with disbelief. I'm suggesting she remove herself from Thornton's reach until a proper divorce hearing can be arranged in a venue where his influence doesn't hold such sway, the sheriff corrected. Denver, perhaps, or even back east. Rebecca shook her head. I have no money of my own. James controlled everything, and I have no family left to turn to. A heavy silence fell over the group, broken only by the soft nickering of the horses and the flapping of laundry in the breeze. Finally, Yates spoke. When is the hearing on Thornton's petition? 3 days from now, Sheriff Booker replied. Wilson will delay as long as he can, but Thornton's putting on the pressure. Yates nodded decisively. Then we have 3 days to come up with a plan. He turned to Rebecca, his blue eyes intense. I promised you wouldn't be taken back against your will. I intend to keep that promise. After the sheriff and his deputies had departed, Yates, Rebecca, and Rose gathered around the kitchen table to discuss their options. I can't ask you both to risk yourselves for me, Rebecca protested. James is vindictive. If he discovers you've helped me evade him, he could make trouble for your ranch. Rose waved away her concerns. Thornton isn't the only one with connections in this territory. Our father was one of the first settlers here, and people still remember him with respect. Besides, Yates added, what kind of man would I be if I turned my back on you now? No, Rebecca, we're in this together. The certainty in his voice brought unexpected tears to Rebecca's eyes. For so long she had been alone in her struggles, isolated by James's controlling nature. To have allies now, people willing to stand beside her against the storm, was overwhelming. Thank you, she whispered. Both of you. Rose reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Now, let's figure out how to keep you out of that monster's clutches and preferably out of an asylum as well. They discussed various options, from Rebecca hiding out in the mountains until a proper divorce hearing could be arranged to her trying to reach Denver, where James's influence might be less pervasive. Each plan had its risks, especially with James and his men actively searching for her. What if, Yates began, then stopped abruptly, a strange expression crossing his face. What? Rose prompted. He shook his head. It's nothing, a crazy idea. We could use a crazy idea right about now, Rebecca said with a weak smile. Yates looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his blue eyes. What if you were already married to someone else? Rebecca blinked in confusion. But I'm not. I'm still legally James's wife. I know that, Yates said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. But what if there was evidence that your marriage to Thornton wasn't legal, that you were already married to someone else before he came along? Rose's eyes widened as she caught onto her brother's train of thought. You mean create a paper trail suggesting Rebecca was already married when Thornton wed her, making their marriage invalid? Exactly, Yates nodded. If Rebecca was already married, then her marriage to Thornton was never legal to begin with. No divorce needed. Rebecca frowned, but I wasn't married before James, and creating false documents would be fraud. Yes, Yates acknowledged, it would. But consider the alternative: being forced back to a man who abuses you, or worse, being committed to an asylum on false pretenses. Put that way, the moral calculus became more complicated. Still, Rebecca hesitated. Even if we wanted to do this, how would we create such evidence? And who would this supposed first husband be? Yates's gaze held her steadily. Me. The word hung in the air between them, simple yet profound in its implications. You, Rebecca repeated, her voice barely a whisper. We could create documentation suggesting we were married 5 years ago, before you met Thornton, Yates explained, the words coming faster now as the plan took shape in his mind. A marriage certificate from a small town church, witnesses who would corroborate the story. We could say we'd separated but never divorced when you met Thornton. Rebecca stared at him, struggling to process the audacity of the plan. But why would you do this? You'd be claiming to be a bigamist, to have allowed your wife to marry another man. Your reputation, my reputation, isn't worth your freedom, Yates said firmly. Besides, in this version of events, I didn't know you had remarried. I was away working cattle drives, came back to find you gone. Rose was nodding slowly, her initial shock giving way to thoughtful consideration. It could work. Judge Wilson might be willing to play along if it gets him out of the difficult position Thornton has put him in, and I know just who could help us create the necessary documents. This is madness, Rebecca said, but she couldn't deny the flutter of hope in her chest. James would never accept it. He wouldn't have a choice, Yates pointed out. If your marriage to him was never legal, he has no claim on you. Rebecca looked between the siblings, these two people who had become so important to her in such a short time. You would really do this for me? In a heartbeat, Yates replied without hesitation, and the certainty in his voice made something warm bloom in Rebecca's chest. Rose stood up decisively. I'll ride into town tomorrow to speak with old man Jenkins. He was the clerk at the county office for 30 years before he retired. If anyone knows how to create convincing records, it's him. As Rose busied herself gathering what she would need for the journey, Rebecca found herself alone with Yates in the kitchen. The magnitude of what he was offering to do for her was almost too much to comprehend. Why? She asked simply, needing to understand. Yates was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point outside the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tinged with an old pain. My mother was trapped in a bad marriage before she met my father, he said. Her first husband was cruel, much like Thornton. When she finally gathered the courage to flee, he had her declared insane. She spent 2 years in an asylum before my father, who was just a young lawyer then, took on her case and got her released. Rebecca's heart ached for the pain she heard in his voice. I'm so sorry, Yates. He turned to look at her, his blue eyes intense. The law is supposed to protect people, not trap them. What Thornton is doing using his wealth and influence to manipulate the legal system, it's wrong. I can't stand by and watch it happen, not when I have the power to stop it. Without thinking, Rebecca reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough from years of ranch work, but his touch was gentle as he curled his fingers around hers. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Something shifted in Yates's expression, a softening around his eyes. Rebecca, whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by Rose's return. I've packed what I'll need for the trip, she announced, then paused, noticing their joined hands. A knowing smile touched her lips, but she made no comment. I'll leave at first light. Rebecca reluctantly released Yates's hand, but the warmth of his touch lingered, as did the memory of the look in his eyes before Rose had entered. There had been something there, something that made her heart beat a little faster whenever she thought about it. That night, Rebecca lay awake long into the small hours, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The plan Yates had proposed was risky and involved deception, something that went against her nature. And yet, when she thought of the alternative, of being forced back to James or committed to an asylum, the moral dilemma seemed less black and white. And then there was Yates himself. In just a few short days, he had become essential to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. His strength, his kindness, his unwavering support all had awakened feelings in her that she had thought James's cruelty had killed forever. The idea of being Yates's wife, even if only on paper, stirred something deep within her that she wasn't yet ready to examine too closely. Dawn was breaking when Rebecca finally drifted off to sleep. Her last conscious thought a prayer that the risky plan would succeed, and that she might finally find the freedom she so desperately sought. Rose departed for Silver Creek as planned, promising to return by nightfall with news. Rebecca spent the day helping Yates around the ranch, grateful for the physical activity that kept her mind from dwelling too much on what lay ahead. They worked side by side mending a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, Rebecca holding the rails steady while Yates hammered them into place. "You're good at this," Yates commented as they completed the repair. Most women from the city wouldn't know one end of a fence rail from the other. Rebecca smiled, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "I wasn't always a lady of leisure," she explained. "Before my father made his fortune in banking, we had a small farm outside Denver. I helped with everything from milking cows to harvesting corn. James didn't appreciate those skills, I take it," Yates said, his tone carefully neutral. "Quite the opposite," Rebecca confirmed. "He was mortified when I offered to help around the ranch. Said it wasn't proper for his wife to engage in manual labor. That's what servants were for." Yates shook his head, a look of genuine bewilderment on his face. "I'll never understand men like that. Why marry a woman only to change everything about her? Control," Rebecca said simply. "James didn't want a partner, he wanted a possession, something to display to others as evidence of his success." Yates was quiet for a moment, packing away his tools. "A man who treats his wife that way isn't successful at all," he finally said. "Not in any way that matters." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Rebecca. "Your wife will be a fortunate woman, Yates Stanton," she said softly. He looked up at her then, his blue eyes intense. "I hope so," he replied, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. They both turned to see a rider approaching fast, too fast for a casual visit. "That's not Rose," Yates said, instantly alert. "She wouldn't push her horse like that." Rebecca felt a chill of foreboding. "James's men." "Stay here," Yates instructed, reaching for the rifle he'd brought with them. "If there's trouble, run for the house." But as the rider drew closer, Rebecca recognized the sheriff's deputy who had accompanied Booker to the ranch the day before. The young man reined in his lathered horse, his expression grave. "Mr. Stanton," he called out, dismounting quickly. "Sheriff sent me. Thornton's men caught Rose in town. They're holding her at the hotel." Rebecca gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh God, is she hurt?" The deputy shook his head. "Not that we know of, madam, but they're demanding a trade Miss Stanton for you." Yates's face had gone hard as stone. "Did Booker arrest them?" He tried, the deputy explained, but Thornton claimed they were just inviting Miss Stanton for a talk. "She went with them before the sheriff could intervene, said something about not wanting trouble." He looked uncomfortable. "Truth is, with Thornton's influence, there wasn't much the sheriff could do without clear evidence of wrongdoing." Rebecca felt sick with guilt. This was her fault. Rose was in danger because she had tried to help Rebecca escape James's clutches. "I have to go back," she said, her voice barely audible. "No," Yates's response was immediate and firm. "That's exactly what Thornton wants." "I can't let Rose suffer because of me," Rebecca insisted, tears threatening. "James can be cruel, Yates, if she doesn't give him what he wants." The muscle in Yates's jaw worked as he visibly struggled with the situation. "When is this exchange supposed to happen?" he asked the deputy. "Tonight, 8 o'clock at the Silver Creek Bridge," Yates nodded grimly. "Tell Sheriff Booker I'll be there. And deputy," he pinned the young man with an intense gaze, "not a word about Miss Hart being here." As far as anyone knows, I'm coming to negotiate for my sister's release, nothing more." After the deputy had departed with his message, Rebecca turned to Yates, her eyes pleading. "You can't seriously be considering going alone. James will have all his men there." "I'm not going alone," Yates replied, his expression determined, "and I'm not handing you over to that monster. But I am getting my sister back." Back at the house, Yates moved with purposeful efficiency, checking his revolver and rifle, gathering ammunition and supplies. "I'm going to need your help," he told Rebecca as he worked. "Rose has friends in town, women she's known since childhood. I need you to write notes to 3 of them asking for their help. Their husbands will come with me." Rebecca nodded, pushing aside her fear to focus on the task at hand. "Tell me their names." Within the hour, Yates had dispatched a ranch hand with the messages, and by late afternoon, 3 grim-faced men had arrived at the Stanton ranch: Tom Miller, the blacksmith; John Peterson, who owned the general store; and Michael Davis, a former Army scout who now ran the livery stable in Silver Creek. "Rose has been like a sister to all of us," Tom explained to Rebecca as the men gathered around the kitchen table to plan. "When Yates was away on cattle drives, our wives took turns checking on her. We won't let Thornton keep her." The plan they devised was simple but risky. Yates would meet Thornton at the bridge as demanded, appearing to be alone. The other 3 men would position themselves nearby, out of sight. If negotiations failed, they would create a diversion, allowing Yates to get Rose to safety. "What about me?" Rebecca asked. "I should be there." "If James sees me, he might let Rose go." "Absolutely not," Yates said, his tone brooking no argument. "You're staying here with Mrs. Peterson if something goes wrong." He hesitated, then continued firmly, "If something goes wrong, she'll help you get away." Rebecca wanted to protest, but the determined set of Yates's jaw told her it would be futile. Instead, she helped the men prepare, making sandwiches for them to take, filling canteens with water, trying to keep her hands busy so they wouldn't shake with fear. As the men prepared to depart, Yates pulled Rebecca aside. In the privacy of the kitchen, he took both her hands in his blue eyes serious. "I need you to promise me something," he said quietly. "If I don't come back with Rose by midnight, you'll go with Mrs. Peterson. She has family in Oregon. You'll be safe there." Rebecca shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "Don't ask me to leave you behind, Yates, not after everything you've done for me." "I'm asking you to stay alive," he replied, his voice rough with emotion, "to have the freedom you deserve." A tear slipped down Rebecca's cheek. "And what about what you deserve? A life without looking over your shoulder for James's revenge." Yates's expression softened, and he reached up to gently wipe away her tear with his thumb. "What I deserve and what I want are 2 different things, Rebecca." "And what do you want?" she whispered, her heart pounding. For an answer, Yates leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it made her heart ache. It was brief, just a gentle pressure before he pulled away, but it conveyed more than words ever could. "I want you safe," he said softly. "Promise me." Rebecca nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Yates gave her hands one final squeeze before joining the other men outside. From the doorway, she watched them ride off toward Silver Creek, Yates's tall figure straight and proud in the saddle. Only when they had disappeared from view did she allow herself to sink to the floor and give in to the tears that had been threatening all day. Mrs. Peterson, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, arrived shortly after the men had departed. She found Rebecca in the kitchen, dry-eyed but pale, methodically cleaning already spotless dishes. "They'll be all right," the older woman assured her, gently taking the plate from Rebecca's hands. "Those are good men, and they won't take foolish risks." Rebecca nodded, wanting to believe it. "I just can't bear the thought that Rose is suffering because of me, or that Yates might." She couldn't finish the sentence. The kiss they had shared, brief though it had been, had confirmed what she had been feeling for days, that Yates Stanton had become essential to her happiness, perhaps even to her very existence. "Yates is as tough as they come," Mrs. Peterson said confidently. "And clever, too. He'll bring Rose home safely." The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Rebecca tried to distract herself by helping Mrs. Peterson prepare a meal, but neither woman had much appetite. As darkness fell, They lit lamps and sat in the main room, Rebecca attempting to focus on mending one of Yates's shirts while Mrs. Peterson knitted, the click of her needles the only sound in the tense silence. When the grandfather clock in the corner struck 10, Rebecca set aside her mending with shaking hands. They should have been back by now. Mrs. Peterson looked up from her knitting, concern evident in her eyes. The meeting was set for 8. Even if all went well, they might not have started back until 9. It's a good hour's ride from the bridge. Rebecca nodded, trying to take comfort in the older woman's logic. But as another hour passed with no sign of the returning party, her anxiety grew until she could barely sit still. "I'm going to check outside," she announced, needing to do something, anything, rather than continue this torturous waiting. The night air was cool and clear, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky like diamonds on black velvet. Rebecca wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked to the edge of the yard, straining her eyes and ears for any sign of approaching riders. The sound, when it finally came, was faint at first, the distant rhythm of hoofbeats. Rebecca's heart leaped with hope, but as the sound grew louder, she realized it was only a single horse approaching at a gallop. Fear replaced hope. One rider, when 5 had departed, could only mean disaster. The horse and rider materialized out of the darkness, and with a surge of relief, Rebecca recognized Yates's tall form. But her relief was short-lived as he drew closer, and she saw that he was slumped forward in the saddle, one arm hanging awkwardly at his side. "Yates!" she cried, running toward him as he reined in his exhausted mount. He practically fell from the saddle, and Rebecca barely managed to catch him, staggering under his weight. His face was alarmingly pale, and his shirt was dark with what she realized with horror was blood. "Rose?" she asked desperately as Mrs. Peterson hurried to help support him. "Safe," Yates managed through gritted teeth. "With the Petersons, Thornton's men ambush, save your strength," Mrs. Peterson instructed, helping Rebecca guide him toward the house. "Rebecca, we need to get him inside and tend to that wound." Between them, they managed to get Yates to his bedroom, where Rebecca helped him out of his blood-soaked shirt while Mrs. Peterson gathered medical supplies. The wound was an ugly gash across his left shoulder, still seeping blood. "Bullet just grazed me," Yates explained weakly as Rebecca began cleaning the wound with trembling hands. "Lucky." "I wouldn't call getting shot lucky," Rebecca retorted, her voice sharp with fear. "What happened?" Despite his obvious pain, Yates's lips quirked in a faint smile. "You're angry." "Of course I'm angry. You could have been killed." The thought made her stomach clench with terror. Mrs. Peterson returned with bandages, a needle and thread, and a bottle of whiskey. "This is going to need stitches," she pronounced after examining the wound. "Rebecca, can you do it?" "My eyes aren't what they used to be for fine work." Rebecca had never stitched a bullet wound before, but she nodded determinedly. "Tell me what to do," under Mrs. Peterson's guidance, Rebecca cleaned the wound thoroughly, then took a deep breath to steady her hands before beginning the delicate work of stitching the torn flesh. Yates bore the pain stoically, only the occasional sharp intake of breath betraying his discomfort. As she worked, he told them what had happened. Thornton was there with Fletcher and 8 men. Rose was unharmed but frightened. "I offered to trade myself for her, said Thornton could do whatever he wanted to me if he let her go." "You what?" Rebecca's hands faltered in their task. "Keep stitching," Mrs. Peterson instructed gently. Rebecca forced herself to continue as Yates went on. "Thornton laughed, said the only trade he'd accept was you. I told him I didn't know where you were. He called me a liar." Yates winced as Rebecca pulled a stitch tight. "Sorry," she murmured. He shook his head slightly. "The sheriff showed up then with a couple of deputies, said he was there to ensure the peace. Thornton had to at least pretend to play nice with the law present. He agreed to release Rose, but as soon as she was with me and we were riding away, his men opened fire from the trees." Rebecca's blood ran cold at the thought of the ambush. "The others, Tom, John, Michael, all fine as far as I know. We scattered when the shooting started. I made sure Rose got away with the Petersons, then drew Thornton's men away from their trail." There was grim satisfaction in his voice. "Led them on a merry chase before I lost them in Bear Creek Canyon." By the time Rebecca had finished stitching and bandaging the wound, Yates was pale and sweating from the pain and loss of blood. Mrs. Peterson coaxed him to drink some laudanum for the pain, and soon after he drifted into an uneasy sleep. The two women retreated to the kitchen, where Mrs. Peterson made strong coffee. "That was well done," the older woman said approvingly. "You've got steady hands in a crisis." Rebecca wrapped her fingers around the warm coffee mug, trying to stop their trembling now that the immediate emergency was past. "He could have died," she said softly, the reality of it hitting her anew. "Because of me. Because of Thornton," Mrs. Peterson corrected firmly. "Don't you take that monster's guilt onto your shoulders, child." They sat in silence for a few minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. "He loves you, you know," Mrs. Peterson said finally, her voice gentle. Rebecca looked up, startled. "He barely knows me." The older woman smiled knowingly. "Some things don't need time. My Henry asked me to marry him 3 days after we met. We had 42 good years together before the influenza took him." Rebecca thought of the kiss Yates had given her before riding out, of the look in his blue eyes, of the risks he had taken for her safety. "Even if he did," she said hesitantly, "I'm still married to James, legally at least." "Legalities can be overcome," Mrs. Peterson replied with a shrug. "But a good man's heart, that's a rare gift, Rebecca. Don't let fear make you reject it." Rebecca pondered those words as she checked on Yates throughout the night, replacing the cool cloth on his forehead when fever set in, making sure he drank water when he stirred. By dawn, she was exhausted but relieved to find his fever had broken and he was sleeping more peacefully. She was dozing in a chair beside his bed when a gentle touch on her arm woke her. Yates was awake, his blue eyes clear as they met hers. "You stayed," he said simply. Rebecca smiled tiredly. "Of course I stayed." His hand found hers, his fingers curling around her own. "I heard what Mrs. Peterson said to you last night, about me loving you." Heat rose in Rebecca's cheeks. She hadn't realized he'd been awake for that conversation. "Yates, she's right," he interrupted quietly. "I know it's fast, and I know your situation is complicated. But I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't just about protecting you or doing what's right. It's about who you are, your strength, your kindness, your courage." Rebecca's heart felt too large for her chest, a sweet ache spreading through her. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself," she confessed. "After James, I didn't think I could trust my heart again, but you're nothing like him. You make me feel safe, but also strong, like I'm more myself when I'm with you." Yates's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Is that your way of saying you love me too, Rebecca Hart?" She laughed softly, the sound strange but welcome after so many hours of fear. "Yes, Yates Stanton, I believe it is." His expression grew serious again. "Thornton won't give up, last night proved that. He's too proud, too used to getting his way." "I know," Rebecca sighed, "and now he'll be even more determined after what happened at the bridge." Yates was silent for a moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "There might be another way," he said finally, "a legal way." Rebecca looked at him questioningly. "Nevada," he explained. "Their divorce laws are more liberal than most. 6 months residency, and you could file on grounds of cruelty without James being present. He'd have no jurisdiction there, no influence with the courts." Hope flared in Rebecca's chest. 6 months is a long time to hide from James." "Not if you weren't hiding alone," Yates replied, his blue eyes intent on hers. "Not if you were with someone who promised to protect you." Rebecca's breath caught. "Are you proposing to come with me to Nevada, Yates Stanton?" His lips curved in a smile. "I'm proposing a lot more than that, Rebecca Hart. When you're free of Thornton, I want to marry you properly, legally, in a way no one can ever question or take away from us." Tears filled Rebecca's eyes, but they were tears of happiness rather than sorrow. "Yes," she whispered, "to all of it, to Nevada, to waiting, to marrying you when I'm truly free." Yates brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then we have a plan," he said softly. The next day brought the return of Rose, escorted by John Peterson and his wife. She rushed to her brother's bedside, her face pale with worry. "I'm so sorry," she said, close to tears. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't been so careless in town." "Hush," Yates interrupted, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "None of this is your fault, Rose. Thornton is to blame, no one else." Rebecca, who had been giving the siblings privacy, stepped back into the room. "He's right, Rose. And I'm the one who should apologize to you. You were put in danger because of me." Rose shook her head firmly. "Because of a cruel man who thinks women are property, not because of you." She looked between Rebecca and her brother, a knowing smile touching her lips. "Besides, I suspect something good has come of all this drama." Yates glanced at Rebecca, his expression softening. "We've decided to go to Nevada," he told his sister. "Rebecca can file for divorce there after establishing residency." Rose nodded thoughtfully. "A sound plan, and after." "After, if she'll still have me," Yates said, his eyes never leaving Rebecca's face, "we'll get married." Rose beamed. "Well, it's about time you found yourself a wife, brother. I was beginning to think I'd be running this ranch alone forever." The three of them spent the rest of the day planning. Nevada was a long journey from Montana territory, and with James actively searching for Rebecca, they would need to be cautious. They decided that Yates and Rebecca would leave as soon as his wound had healed enough for travel, taking a roundabout route to avoid detection. Rose would stay behind to manage the ranch and keep up appearances in town. "What if Thornton comes here looking for Rebecca?" Rose asked, a legitimate concern in her voice. "Sheriff Booker will help," Yates assured her. "After what happened at the bridge, he's firmly on our side. And you'll have the Petersons, the Millers, and the Davises close by. They won't let anything happen to you or the ranch." As the day wore on, Rebecca found moments to be alone with Yates, sitting beside him on the porch swing as the sunset painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. "Leaving your home, your livelihood for months, all for me." Yates took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "This place will still be here when we return, and Rose is more than capable of running things in my absence." His blue eyes were serious as they met hers. "What I'm not willing to risk losing is you, Rebecca." She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of his injury. "I keep thinking about what James will do when he discovers we've gone. He's not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. By the time he figures out where we've gone, it will be too late," Yates said confidently. "Nevada is a big place, and Thornton's influence doesn't extend that far." Rebecca wished she could share his certainty. James Thornton had proven himself to be relentless in his pursuit of what he considered his property. But looking up at Yates's strong profile against the darkening sky, she found herself believing that maybe, just maybe, they could outrun her past and build a future together. Over the next 2 weeks, as Yates's wound healed, they made careful preparations for their journey. Maps were studied, provisions gathered, arrangements made for funds to be wired to them once they reached Nevada. Rose insisted on giving Rebecca some of her own clothes and a few small treasures, a locket that had belonged to their mother, a book of poetry their father had loved. "To remind you that you'll always have family here," Rose said as she pressed the items into Rebecca's hands. "No matter what happens." The night before their planned departure, Rebecca found herself unable to sleep. She slipped out of bed and made her way to the porch, where she stood gazing up at the star-strewn sky, trying to memorize the view of Stanton Ranch under moonlight. She had been there for only a few weeks, but it had become more of a home to her than Thornton Ranch had been in 3 years. Here, she had found not just sanctuary, but acceptance, respect, love. The soft creak of the door announced Yates's presence before his arms slipped around her waist from behind. "Couldn't sleep," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Rebecca leaned back against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Just saying goodbye to this place, for now." "We'll come back," Yates promised. "After the divorce is final, after we're married, this will be our home, Rebecca, yours and mine." She turned in his arms, looking up at his face silvered by moonlight. "I never thought I'd have this," she admitted. "After everything with James, I'd convinced myself that love, real love, wasn't meant for me." Yates cupped her cheek in his palm, his touch reverent. "It was always meant for you. I was just the lucky man who got to show you." When he kissed her, it was different from the desperate farewell before the confrontation at the bridge. This was a promise, slow and sweet, full of hope for the future they would build together. Rebecca melted into it, her arms winding around his neck, her heart so full it seemed impossible it wouldn't overflow. They departed at dawn the next morning, 2 horses laden with supplies, a third carrying Rebecca. Rose stood in the yard to see them off, her eyes bright with unshed tears but her smile brave. 6 months, Yates reminded her, leaning down from his saddle to hug his sister. Take care of our home. 6 months, Rose agreed, and then I expect a new sister when you return. Rebecca, who had already said her tearful goodbyes, managed a smile. I'll keep him out of trouble, Rose. See that you do, Rose replied with a wink. He's the only brother I've got. With a final wave, they rode away from Stanton Ranch, taking the trail north toward the Canadian border. Their plan was to cross into Canada, then travel west before turning south into Nevada, a roundabout route designed to throw off any pursuit. As they crested the ridge where Rebecca had first seen the ranch, she turned in her saddle for one last look at the place that had become her sanctuary. The morning sun gilded the small cabin and outbuildings, the creek glinting like a silver ribbon through the property. Rose still stood in the yard, a diminutive figure with her hand raised in farewell. It's beautiful, Rebecca said softly. Yates, who had stopped his horse beside hers, nodded. It is, and it will be even more beautiful when we return. He reached across the space between them to take her hand. Ready for our adventure, Miss Hart? Rebecca looked from the ranch to the man beside her, his blue eyes bright with love and determination. The road ahead would not be easy, she knew. James would not give up his claim easily. There would be hardships on the journey, challenges in establishing a new life in Nevada, legal hurdles to overcome. But for the first time in years, Rebecca felt truly free. Not just free from James's control, but free to choose her own path, to love and be loved openly. Ready, Mr. Stanton, she replied, squeezing his hand. Lead on. Together, they turned their horses away from the ranch and toward the future that awaited them, leaving behind the shadows of the past for the promise of a new dawn. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in the small church in Virginia City, Nevada, hardly able to believe the day had finally arrived. The divorce decree had been granted a week ago, the judge sympathetic to her account of James Thornton's cruelty. Now, dressed in a simple white gown sewn by the wife of their landlord, she was about to become Mrs. Yates Stanton. The months in Nevada had not been easy. They had taken small rooms above a mercantile store, living frugally while Yates found work as a horse trainer at a nearby ranch and Rebecca took in mending and sewing. There had been a tense moment 2 months into their stay when a stranger asking questions about a woman matching Rebecca's description had passed through town, but he had moved on without discovering them. Through it all, Yates had been her rock, his love and support never wavering. They had built a life together in this temporary home, getting to know each other more deeply with each passing day. Rebecca had discovered Yates's passion for teaching young horses, his surprising talent for sketching, his fondness for peppermint candy. He had learned of her love for music, her skill with numbers, her secret dream of someday writing stories. And now, as she walked down the short aisle of the church on the arm of their landlord, Mr. Jenkins, who had graciously agreed to give her away, Rebecca's eyes were fixed on Yates waiting at the altar. He looked handsome in his new suit, his hair neatly combed, his blue eyes bright with emotion as they met hers. Rose stood beside him as his attendant, having arrived by stage a week earlier for the wedding. Her presence was the final piece that made this day perfect. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, traditional vows spoken with deep sincerity. When Yates slipped the gold band onto Rebecca's finger, a band he had saved for months to purchase, his hands were steady, but his voice trembled slightly with emotion. With this ring I thee wed, he said, the words a sacred promise. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Yates's kiss was gentle but filled with such love that Rebecca felt tears of joy gathering in her eyes. Mrs. Stanton, he whispered against her lips. My husband, she replied, the words still holding a hint of wonder. The small reception was held at the Jenkinses' home, a modest celebration with the few friends they had made during their time in Virginia City. As the afternoon waned, Rose pulled Rebecca aside, her expression unusually serious. "I have news," she said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "A letter came from Sheriff Booker just before I left Silver Creek." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. "James," Rose nodded grimly. "He's been through town several times, questioning people about where you might have gone. The sheriff has managed to keep him from learning anything, but—" She hesitated. "He seems to be growing more desperate, more erratic. His business is suffering, apparently. There are rumors he's drinking heavily." Rebecca absorbed this information, surprised to find that it stirred more pity than fear in her heart. "He never truly loved me," she said softly, "only the idea of owning me. Which is why he can't let go," Rose agreed. "But you're legally free of him now, and after today, you have a new name, a new life." Rebecca smiled, her gaze finding Yates across the room where he was engaged in conversation with Mr. Jenkins. As if sensing her attention, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that never failed to make her heart beat faster. "A new life," she echoed, "one I never dared dream of." 2 weeks after the wedding, with spring beginning to soften the Nevada landscape, Yates and Rebecca began the journey back to Montana Territory. Rose had already departed, eager to return to the ranch she had managed capably in her brother's absence. As they crossed the border back into the territory, Rebecca felt a momentary apprehension. Somewhere in this vast land, James Thornton was still nursing his grievances, perhaps still searching for her. But the woman returning was not the same frightened, broken person who had fled. She was Rebecca Stanton now, stronger, more confident, and legally married to a man who viewed her as an equal partner rather than a possession. Stanton Ranch looked much as they had left it, though Rose had made some improvements: a fresh coat of paint on the cabin, new curtains at the windows, a small flower garden blooming beside the porch. She rushed out to greet them as they rode into the yard, hugging them both with tears of joy. "Welcome home," she said, and the simple words filled Rebecca with contentment. The first few weeks of married life at the ranch were a time of adjustment and joy. Rebecca took over the management of the household, working alongside Rose rather than replacing her. Yates returned to the work of the ranch with enthusiasm, glad to be home on his own land. In the evenings, the three of them would sit on the porch, talking and laughing, a family bound by love rather than just blood. It was on such an evening, nearly a month after their return, that they heard riders approaching. Yates immediately tensed, reaching for the rifle he kept by the door. "Stay inside," he instructed Rebecca and Rose, his expression grim. Rebecca's heart pounded as she watched from the window while Yates stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. 3 riders came into view, and even in the fading light, she recognized the burly figure of Fletcher. "Stanton," Fletcher called out, reining in his horse at a safe distance from the porch. "We've come for a word." "You're trespassing on private property," Yates replied, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Say your piece and then ride out." Fletcher dismounted slowly, his hands carefully away from his weapon. "Mr. Thornton wants to speak with his wife." Rebecca's blood ran cold. After all this time, James was still pursuing her. She reached for Rose's hand, finding comfort in the reassuring squeeze the other woman gave her. "There is no Mrs. Thornton here," Yates replied evenly. "Only my wife, Mrs. Rebecca Stanton, and my sister, Miss Rose Stanton." Fletcher's expression darkened. "Mr. Thornton has papers, I have papers too," Yates interrupted. "A divorce decree granted by a judge in Nevada and a marriage certificate naming Rebecca Hart as my lawful wedded wife." "Your employer has no claim here, Fletcher." One of the other men leaned forward in his saddle. "Mr. Thornton figured you might say that. That's why he's waiting in Silver Creek, wants to talk to the lady himself." Rebecca moved to the door then, unable to remain hidden while others decided her fate. "Yates," she said softly, stepping onto the porch beside him. "I should go." He looked at her in surprise. "Rebecca, no, you don't owe him anything." "I know," she replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice was. But perhaps this is the only way to end it once and for all, to face him and show him that I'm no longer afraid, that I've built a life he can't touch. She laid a hand on Yates's arm. I'm not suggesting I go alone. But I think I need to do this. Yates studied her face, concern warring with respect in his blue eyes. Finally, he nodded slightly. All right, but we go together and we meet him on neutral ground with witnesses present. He turned back to Fletcher. Tell your employer we'll meet him tomorrow at noon at the sheriff's office. Fletcher looked as if he wanted to argue, but after a moment he nodded curtly. Noon, sheriff's office. He remounted his horse. Mr. Thornton will be pleased you're being reasonable. I'm being anything but reasonable, Yates replied, his voice hard. I'm protecting my wife from a man who has already proven himself dangerous. The only reason I'm agreeing to this meeting at all is because Rebecca wishes it. After Fletcher and his men had departed, Rose made coffee while Rebecca and Yates discussed the upcoming confrontation. Despite her brave words, Rebecca was trembling at the prospect of facing James again. You don't have to do this, Yates reminded her, taking her hands in his. We could leave, go back to Nevada, start fresh somewhere James would never find us. Rebecca shook her head. This is our home, Yates. I won't let him drive us from it. She squeezed his hands. Besides, I'm not the same woman who fled from him. I'm stronger now, I have you. The next morning, they rode into Silver Creek together, Rose insisting on accompanying them despite their concerns for her safety. The small town seemed unusually quiet as they made their way to the sheriff's office, but Rebecca was aware of curious eyes watching from store windows and porches. Sheriff Booker was waiting for them, his weathered face grave. He's inside, he informed them. Alone, as agreed, I searched him myself, no weapons. Yates nodded, his expression determined. Thank you, Sheriff, for everything you've done to help us. The older man clasped Yates's shoulder briefly. You're your father's son, Stanton, doing what's right, no matter the cost. Inside the office, James Thornton rose from a chair as they entered. Rebecca's first thought was how much he had changed in the month since she had last seen him. Always a large, imposing man, he seemed to have shrunk somehow, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame, his face haggard beneath his neatly trimmed beard. Only his eyes were unchanged, cold, and calculating as they fixed on her. Rebecca, he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent that had once impressed her. You're looking well. Marriage to a cowboy appears to agree with you. Rebecca felt Yates tense beside her but kept her own voice calm. Hello, James. Yes, I am well, happier than I've been in a very long time. James's smile didn't reach his eyes. How touching, and yet I find myself wondering if your new husband knows that he married a liar and a thief. Watch yourself, Thornton, Yates warned, his hand tightening on Rebecca's. James raised an eyebrow. Oh. Has she not told you about the jewelry she took when she fled? Family heirlooms, quite valuable, or about her? Episodes? The fits of hysteria, the delusions. The only delusion, Rebecca replied steadily, was my belief that you ever cared for me as a person rather than a possession. I took nothing from your home that wasn't mine by right, gifts you gave me, items I purchased with my own inheritance. As for these supposed episodes, they existed only in your mind, a convenient explanation for a wife who dared to question your authority. James's facade of civility slipped, anger flashing in his eyes. You were my wife, he hissed, mine by law and by right, and you ran like a thief in the night. She ran like a prisoner escaping unjust confinement, Rose spoke up, her voice surprisingly firm for someone of her small stature. And now she's free of you, legally and morally. James dismissed Rose with a contemptuous glance. This doesn't concern you, Miss Stanton. It concerns all of us, Sheriff Booker interjected from where he stood by the door. Now, Mr. Thornton, you asked for this meeting. State your purpose plainly or conclude it. I won't have threats or intimidation in my office. James straightened, smoothing his expression into one of injured dignity. Very well, I came to make an offer, a settlement, if you will. Rebecca frowned in confusion. What kind of settlement? Financial compensation, James explained, as if speaking to a child. For the embarrassment you've caused me, the damage to my reputation. In return, I'll agree to drop any claims against you or... His gaze flicked dismissively to Yates, your new husband. Yates stiffened. You have no legal claims to drop, Thornton. The divorce is final, the marriage is legal. Rebecca owes you nothing. Perhaps in the eyes of the law, James conceded with a thin smile, but the court of public opinion is another matter. I have influence in this territory, Mr. Stanton. Influence that could make life difficult for a small rancher and his runaway bride. It was a threat, thinly veiled but clear. Rebecca felt a flicker of the old fear, but it was quickly replaced by something else: anger. This man had controlled her for 3 years through isolation and intimidation. He had tried to have her declared insane when she escaped. He had endangered Rose, had Yates shot. And still, he stood here demanding more, unable to accept that she was no longer his to command. No, she said, the words simple but firm. James blinked, seemingly taken aback by the direct refusal. No, no settlement, no payment, no further contact. Rebecca stepped forward, her hands still clasped in Yates's. I was your wife, James, not your property. The law has recognized my right to leave a cruel marriage. It's time for you to recognize it as well. James's face darkened with anger. You ungrateful, that's enough, Sheriff Booker cut in sharply. Mrs. Stanton has given you her answer, Mr. Thornton. I suggest you accept it and return to your own affairs. For a moment it seemed as if James might lose his composure completely, his hands clenched at his sides, his face flushing with rage. But then, with visible effort, he regained control. Very well, he said, his voice cold. But remember, Rebecca, I offered you a civilized resolution. What comes next is of your own making. With that ominous statement, he strode past them and out of the office. Through the window, Rebecca watched as he mounted his horse and rode away, his back rigid with fury. That went about as well as could be expected, Sheriff Booker sighed. But I'd be careful for a while, Yates. Men like Thornton don't take defeat easily. Yates nodded grimly. I know, we'll be watchful. As they left the sheriff's office, Rebecca found herself scanning the street nervously, half expecting to see Fletcher and his men waiting to ambush them. But the only people visible were the usual townspeople going about their business, though many cast curious glances their way. You were magnificent, Yates told her as they mounted their horses for the ride home. Standing up to him like that, Rebecca managed a smile, though her hands still trembled slightly. I wasn't sure I could do it, face him I mean, but once I was there I realized something important. What's that? Rose asked, bringing her horse alongside Rebecca's. That I'm not afraid of him anymore, Rebecca replied with genuine surprise. Oh, I'm cautious. I know he can be dangerous, but the fear that used to paralyze me, it's gone. Yates reached across to squeeze her hand. That's because you know who you are now. Not Mrs. James Thornton, property of a wealthy rancher, but Rebecca Stanton, strong and free. As they rode home, Rebecca reflected on Yates's words. He was right. In finding him, in building this new life, she had also found herself the self that had been buried beneath years of James's control and cruelty. The next few weeks passed peacefully, with no sign of James or his men. Spring bloomed fully into summer, bringing long days of ranch work and warm evenings on the porch. Rebecca found herself settling into life as Yates's wife with a contentment she had never expected to feel. She helped with the ranch accounts, learned to ride better under Rose's patient tutelage, and even began to put her childhood farm skills to use in expanding the vegetable garden. It was in this garden, on a warm July afternoon, that she first realized something had changed. The slight dizziness that came over her as she rose from weeding, the tenderness in her breasts, the subtle shifts in her body that she recognized from her medical reading. After 3 years of hoping and disappointment in her marriage to James, Rebecca was cautious about her suspicions. But as the symptoms persisted, hope bloomed alongside the summer flowers. She waited another week before sharing her suspicions with Yates, wanting to be as certain as possible before raising his hopes. They had spoken of children, both eager to start a family, but knowing it might take time. She chose a quiet evening when Rose was visiting friends in town. After supper, as they sat on the porch swing watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, Rebecca took Yates's hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. I think, she said softly, that Stanton Ranch may have a new resident come winter. Yates stared at her for a moment, confusion giving way to dawning comprehension. Rebecca, he breathed, are you saying? She nodded, happiness bubbling up inside her. I can't be completely certain yet, but yes, I believe I'm carrying your child. The joy that transformed his face was something Rebecca knew she would remember for the rest of her days. Without a word, Yates gathered her in his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When he finally drew back, there were tears in his blue eyes. A child, he said wonderingly, our child. His hand returned to her stomach, gentle and protective. Hello in there, little one, he whispered. Your mama and I can't wait to meet you. Rebecca's own eyes filled with tears at the tenderness in his voice. This was what love looked like, she realized. Not possession or control, but this gentle reverence, this shared joy. When Rose returned from town the next day, they shared the news with her. Her delighted squeal could probably have been heard all the way in Silver Creek as she hugged them both. I'm going to be an aunt, she exclaimed, dancing around the kitchen. Oh, this calls for a celebration. I'll bake a cake. As summer waned into fall, Rebecca's condition became more pronounced, her slender form now showing the gentle curve that housed their growing child. Yates was endearingly protective, insisting she rest frequently and handling the more strenuous chores himself. Rose, equally excited about the impending arrival, began knitting tiny garments and planning renovations to convert a storage room off their bedroom into a nursery. It was during this happy, busy time that James Thornton made his final attempt to disrupt their lives. The letter arrived on a crisp October day, delivered by a nervous young man from the telegraph office in Silver Creek. Addressed to Mrs. Rebecca Thornton, its very existence was an insult, a denial of her divorce and remarriage. Rebecca's hands shook as she opened it, Yates and Rose watching with concern. The contents were brief but chilling. James demanded that she return to him, claiming that her pregnancy proved their marriage had been valid and that the child she carried was rightfully his. He threatened legal action, claiming that Nevada divorce decrees weren't recognized in certain eastern states where he had business interests, and that he could have her marriage to Yates invalidated. He's delusional, Yates said flatly after reading the letter. Even if he found some legal loophole, which I doubt exists, the timing alone proves the child is mine, not his. It's not about the child, Rebecca realized, sinking into a kitchen chair. Or about me, really. It's about his pride, his need to win. She placed a protective hand over her swollen belly. He can't stand that I escaped him, that I found happiness without him. Rose took the letter and reread it, her expression thoughtful. There's something desperate about this. It doesn't sound like the calculated man you've described. Rebecca nodded slowly. You're right. This isn't the James I knew. He was always cold, controlled. This is, she searched for the word, reckless. I'll take this to Judge Wilson, Yates decided. He should know that Thornton is still making threats, still refusing to accept the divorce. But before Yates could leave for town, they heard the now familiar sound of approaching riders. This time, it wasn't just a few men, but what sounded like a sizable group. Stay inside, Yates instructed, reaching for his rifle. Both of you. Rebecca and Rose moved to the window, peering out cautiously. What they saw made Rebecca's blood run cold. James himself was leading a group of at least 10 men, Fletcher among them, all armed and looking grimly determined. He's come himself this time, she whispered, fear clutching at her heart. Not fear for herself, but for Yates, for Rose, for the unborn child she carried. Yates stepped onto the porch, rifle ready but not raised. That's far enough, Thornton, he called out as the group approached the yard. James reined in his horse, his cold gaze taking in the ranch, the cabin, the man who stood protecting it. I've come for my wife, Stanton, he announced loudly, and the child she carries. There is no Mrs. Thornton here, Yates replied, his voice carrying clearly in the autumn air. Only my wife, Rebecca Stanton, and our unborn child. You have no claim on either. James's face twisted with rage. She was mine first, he snarled, abandoning the veneer of civilization he usually maintained. Everything she is, everything she has, belongs to me by right. "A woman isn't a piece of property to be owned," Yates responded, his voice steady despite the dangerous situation. "Rebecca chose to leave you. The law supported her choice. It's over, Thornton. Go home." For a moment it seemed as if James might order his men to attack. Fletcher's hand was already moving toward his gun. But then, a new sound reached them: hoofbeats, coming fast from the direction of town. All eyes turned to see Sheriff Booker leading a group of horsemen toward the ranch, familiar faces from Silver Creek. Men who had helped Yates rescue Rose months earlier, neighbors and friends who had heard of James's intentions and ridden out to stand with the Stantons. James's expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time. He had counted on outnumbering Yates, on intimidating him into surrendering Rebecca. But now the forces were more evenly matched, and the presence of the sheriff complicated matters. Rebecca stepped onto the porch then, unable to remain hidden while others fought her battle. Her pregnancy was obvious now, her condition unmistakable. "James," she called out, her voice stronger than she felt, "this has gone far enough. I am not your wife anymore. This child is not yours. You need to accept that and move on with your life." James's gaze fixed on her rounded belly, his expression a mixture of rage and something that might almost have been grief. "You promised to be mine forever," he said, his voice carrying a hint of the charm that had once captivated her. "Before God and man, you made those vows. Vows that were broken by cruelty," Rebecca replied steadily. "The law has recognized that. Why can't you?" Sheriff Booker and his men had reached them now, forming a protective line between James's group and the cabin. "Mr. Thornton," the sheriff said formally, "I've received complaints from several citizens about a large armed group heading toward Stanton Ranch with apparent ill intent. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you and your men to disarm and state your business." James's face contorted with frustration. "This is a private matter, Sheriff, between me and my wife." "Ex-wife," Booker corrected firmly, "and threatening an armed confrontation on private property isn't a private matter, it's a matter for the law." For a tense moment, it seemed as if James might defy the sheriff, might order his men to fight despite being outnumbered. But then, with a visible effort, he regained his composure. "Very well," he said coldly. "We'll leave, but this isn't over, Rebecca. A man has rights, even in this God-forsaken territory." "Your rights ended with the divorce decree," Yates replied, still standing protectively in front of Rebecca. "I suggest you accept that before you end up facing charges more serious than trespassing." With a final venomous look, James wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following reluctantly. Fletcher cast a dark glance back at the ranch, a promise of retribution in his eyes that made Rebecca shiver despite the warm sunshine. Once they had disappeared from view, Sheriff Booker dismounted with a groan. "I'm getting too old for this kind of excitement," he complained good-naturedly. "Mrs. Stanton, you're looking well despite the circumstances. When is the little one due?" "December," Rebecca replied, her hand instinctively going to her belly. "And thank you, Sheriff, all of you," she added, looking at the men who had ridden out to their defense. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't arrived when you did." "We've got eyes and ears all over this county," Tom Miller, the blacksmith, explained. "When Thornton started gathering men and making noises about reclaiming his property, word spread fast. No one was about to let him harm you or your family." The show of community support brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. "Thank you," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. After ensuring that James and his men had truly departed and weren't lying in wait nearby, the sheriff and most of his impromptu posse returned to town. Tom Miller and John Peterson, however, insisted on staying overnight, just to be safe. "Thornton's a proud man," John explained as they sat around the kitchen table that evening. "Being publicly thwarted like that in front of his men and half the county. It's a blow his pride may not recover from easily." "What do you think he'll do?" Rose asked, pouring coffee for everyone. Tom shrugged his broad shoulders. "Hard to say. Men like that, when they're backed into a corner, can be unpredictable, but my guess. He'll either slink away to lick his wounds, or he'll try something truly desperate. Either way," Yates said grimly, "we'll be ready for him." But James Thornton never returned to Stanton Ranch. 2 weeks after the confrontation, news reached them that he had suffered a sudden collapse at his ranch house and died before a doctor could be summoned. The official cause was listed as apoplexy, a stroke brought on, some whispered, by his increasingly erratic behavior and heavy drinking in recent months. Rebecca received the news with a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the threat to her new family was gone, but also a strange, unexpected sadness for the man James might have been, for the life they might have had if he had been capable of true love rather than mere possession. "Are you all right?" Yates asked gently, finding her sitting alone on the porch after the news had arrived. Rebecca nodded, her hand absently stroking her rounded belly where their child grew. "I'm just thinking about how differently everything might have turned out. If James had been a different kind of man, or if I had never found the courage to leave, or if you hadn't been riding by that water trough on that particular morning." Yates sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "I've thought about that too. How many small decisions, small moments had to align for us to find each other." His blue eyes were serious as they met hers. "Some might call it chance. I prefer to think it was meant to be." Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I believe that too," she said softly. "That we were always meant to find each other, to build this life together." As winter settled over Montana territory, bringing snow that blanketed Stanton Ranch in pristine white, Rebecca's time drew near. The small room off their bedroom had been transformed into a cozy nursery, with a cradle Yates had crafted himself and quilts Rose had lovingly stitched. Dr. Harrison from Silver Creek had been notified to expect a summons any day, and a local midwife had agreed to stay at the ranch for the final week. The labor began on a clear, cold December night, startling Rebecca from sleep with its first insistent pains. Yates, instantly alert, lit the lamps and helped her walk slowly around the room as Rose rode for the midwife and doctor. "You're doing wonderfully," he murmured, supporting her through each contraction. "Just breathe, my love, breathe and remember that our child is almost here." The labor was long but uncomplicated, and as dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, Rebecca gave a final, exhausted push, and their daughter slipped into the waiting hands of the midwife. "A girl," the woman announced, quickly cleaning the squalling infant. "A beautiful, healthy girl." When they placed the tiny bundle in Rebecca's arms, she felt a love so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. The baby had a dusting of dark hair, but when she blinked open her eyes briefly, Rebecca caught a glimpse of blue that promised to match her father's. "She's perfect," Yates whispered, his voice choked with emotion as he sat on the bed beside them, one finger gently stroking the infant's velvety cheek. "Just like her mother." "What will you call her?" Rose asked from the doorway, her own eyes glistening with happy tears. Rebecca and Yates exchanged a look. They had discussed names but hadn't made a final decision. Now, looking at their daughter's tiny face, Rebecca knew the right name. "Hope," she said softly. "Hope Rose Stanton." Yates nodded, his smile tender. "Hope. Because that's what you gave me when you came into my life, and Rose for the sister who helped make our family possible." Rose's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening with surprise and joy. "Oh, that's perfect." As the first light of the new day filtered through the bedroom window, Rebecca looked at the family that surrounded her. Yates, his blue eyes full of love. Rose, beaming with aunt's pride, and tiny Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware of the journey that had brought her parents together, of the obstacles they had overcome to create this moment. From that desperate flight from Thornton Ranch, to hiding behind a water trough as bullets flew, to Yates's brave declaration that James's men would have to go through him to take her back, every step had led here, to this perfect moment, to this love that filled her heart to overflowing. "Thank you," she whispered to Yates, reaching for his hand. He didn't have to ask what she was thanking him for. He simply raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Always," he promised, and in that one word was a lifetime of love, protection, and partnership. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting down to cover the land in a fresh blanket of white. But within the walls of Stanton Ranch, All was warmth and joy as the family welcomed its newest member and looked toward a future bright with promise. For Rebecca, who had once thought herself trapped forever in a loveless marriage, it was more than she had ever dared to dream: a loving husband, a beautiful daughter, a home filled with laughter and respect. And it had all begun with a desperate escape, a chance encounter, and a cowboy brave enough to stand between her and danger, declaring that those who would harm her would first have to go through him.